the first thing Mara noticed about the god was that it hummed. Not the deep, resonant hymn the priests described. The voice of divine breath moving across the firmament, they said, the exhalation of a being so vast that its lungs were the size of continents. What she heard, lying flat against the basalt ridge with her cheek pressed to stone still warm from the day's heat, was mechanical. It was the sound of coolant cycling through pipes, the sound of a turbine at 3/4 load. She had grown up in the maintenance warrens beneath Settlement 6, and she knew the difference between sacred and engineered. She raised her scope. The object hung in the sky 3 kilometers up, roughly where it had always been, where it had been since before her grandmother's grandmother drew breath on this world. It was the size of a city block if city blocks were made of black metal and studded with sensor clusters and trailing cables thick as old growth, trees down to anchor points on the plateau. In the dying light it caught the red of Korath's twin suns and threw it back distorted, so that to someone standing below without a scope, to one of the faithful in the valley, say, pressing their forehead to the packed earth in evening prayer, it might look like the eye of something ancient watching them with sleepy, blood-colored patience. But Mara had a scope. She could see the seams in the hull plating. She could see the maintenance hatches. She could see, if she looked long enough at the ventral surface where the priests said the god's mouth was, that what they called a mouth was in fact an aperture fitted with what appeared to be a directed energy emitter of substantial yield. A god that needed a mouth to burn things was not a god. She slid back from the ridge before the patrol drone completed its arc and rolled into the shadows of the gully where the others were waiting. There were 4 of them. Doss, who was built like a door frame and had a laugh that could startle birds off a wire at 100 meters. Tene, small and precise, who had been an engineer's assistant before the Covenant, found out she was asking the wrong kind of questions about load-bearing calculations and had her flogged publicly for the sin of curiosity. Ben, the oldest, who had been in cells that Mara had not yet been born to see. And Yusuf, 17 years old and so frightened he was trying not to show it, which made him seem angry instead, which made him look brave, which was almost the same thing. She dropped to her haunches in the gully. 3 patrols, she said, staggered. The eastern approach has a 14-second window between the second and third sweep. 14 seconds, Doss said. 14. He looked at Tene, who was already recalculating something on the scratched surface of her handheld. Tene made a small, satisfied sound that was as close as she came to enthusiasm. Enough, Tene said. Ben did not say anything. He was watching Mara the way he had been watching her for 6 months, since she had first walked into the room where the remnants of the resistance met and laid out what she knew, which was a great deal, and what she intended to do about it, which was everything. He watched her the way old soldiers watch young ones, not with doubt exactly, but with a kind of careful attention, as though they were cataloging the ways in which this might go wrong so they could say afterward that they had seen it coming. "You worried?" she asked him. "Always," he said. Yusuf pulled his jacket tighter. The nights on this plateau were cold enough to find the gaps in your clothes and live there. He said, "What if it's real?" No one answered him for a moment. He said, pushing forward into the silence because he was 17 and silence made him nervous. "What if we get up there and it turns out?" "It won't," Mara said. "But if it, Yusuf." Her voice was not unkind. She reached over and gripped his shoulder, just once, firm. "I have been inside Settlement 6's maintenance warrens since I was 8 years old. I have seen the equipment that keeps the air processors running and the water reclamation working. I have looked at every piece of machinery this world runs on, and none of it descended from the sky on its own. Someone built all of it." She looked up at the shape hanging in the sky. "Someone built that too." Yusuf followed her gaze. In the dark the object was harder to see, just a patch of deeper black against the stars. But the hum was always there if you listened for it. "Okay," he said quietly. They moved at the second patrol's rotation. The anchor cable was 40 meters of braided composite, each strand individually thicker than a man's fist. Up close it smelled of oxidized metal and something else, something chemical that Tene identified as a stabilizing polymer used in large-scale load-bearing structures, and that Mara identified as the smell of something built by hands that were not entirely unlike her own. They went up in pairs, using the climbing rigs Tene had fabbed from salvaged drone components over the past 4 months. The rigs were quiet, but not silent. Every 30 seconds, Mara paused and listened for the patrol drones and heard instead only the wind cutting across the plateau and, Beneath everything, the constant mechanical exfoliation of the object above. At 60 meters up, she found the first marking. She almost missed it. It was on the underside of a junction housing, stamped into the metal in characters she didn't recognize at first glance, and then recognized with a lurch that felt physical, like stepping on a stair that wasn't there. She pulled out her lamp and shielded it with her hand and looked at the marking for a long moment. It was in Terran Standard, a manufacturing code and a date. The date was 112 years ago. Her mouth was dry. She climbed. The maintenance hatch was where she had estimated it would be based on the hull geometry. Tenny was beside her by the time she reached it, and Tenny looked at the lock mechanism for approximately 4 seconds before producing a tool from somewhere in her coat and saying, 11 minutes, in the tone of someone who found this mildly insulting to her skills. It took her 8. The hatch swung inward on pneumatic hinges, and the smell that came out was recycled air and machine oil, and underneath both of those, something else that it took Mara several seconds to identify as food. Old food, the stale residue of meals eaten in enclosed spaces over a long period of time. The smell of habitation. Someone lived here. They went in. The interior of the object was not what the Covenant described. The Covenant described the interior of the god as infinite, as a space that existed outside of space, as a realm of pure light in which the divine presence moved like weather. What Mara found was a corridor approximately 2 meters wide and 2.5 meters tall, lit by strips of bioluminescence paneling that had faded to a yellow-green, lined with conduit bundles and equipment racks, with a rubberized deck plate beneath her feet that flexed slightly under her weight. It was a ship. It was clearly, obviously, inescapably a ship. She stood in the corridor and breathed and let the fact of it settle into her like cold water. 112 years ago, someone had brought this ship to Korathith and parked it in the sky and told everyone below that it was a god. And for 112 years, the people below had believed them, because the ship was large enough and old enough and mysterious enough, and because the people who controlled the ship had weapons that burned anyone who refused to believe, and because the generations had passed and the children had grown up under the ship the way children grow up under the sky, without questioning it, because it was simply there, because it had always been there, because anything that has always been there becomes, in time, a given. Doss appeared at her shoulder. He looked down the corridor and then at her. "Huh," he said. It was, she thought, a reasonable response. They split into 2 pairs, Doss and Ben going aft toward what looked like engineering spaces, Mara and Tene moving forward. Yusuf stayed at the hatch, watching the cable approach in case they needed to leave quickly, which Mara expected they would. The forward sections were older. The corridors narrowed and the paneling yellowed further, and in places showed the marks of repairs done in haste with materials that didn't quite match. Patches in hull plating where something had struck it from outside, junction boxes rewired with components that had been salvaged rather than manufactured to spec. This ship had not had a supply line in a long time. Whatever it was running on improvisation and institutional memory. She found the first crew quarters and pushed the door open. Empty. The bunk was made with a precision that spoke of long habit. On the small shelf above it, a framed image, too small to make out in the faded bioluminescent light. She crossed the room and picked it up. A family portrait, man, woman, 2 children, dressed in the clothes of a century ago, looking at the camera with the slightly rigid smiles of people who were not comfortable having their picture taken. The man was dark-skinned and serious-looking, with the kind of face that took responsibility seriously. The woman had the man's eyes, or he had hers. The children were maybe 8 and 10, girl and boy. The girl making a face at the camera that the boy was pretending to disapprove of. Mara put the picture down carefully. She moved on. The command center was in the forward section, behind a door that required a biometric check that no longer worked. The scanner had been jury, rigged with a simple mechanical bypass, which suggested either that the original lock had failed or that someone had made the conscious decision to leave it accessible. She pushed through. The command center was circular, perhaps 15 meters across, ringed with inactive display panels and navigation equipment, and at the center, a command chair that was currently occupied. The man sitting in it was old. Not old in the way of someone who had aged normally, old in the way of someone who had been through a great many specific things that had each taken a year off the expected total and then some. His hair was white, and his face was the face of a man who had made a very large mistake a very long time ago, and had been living inside that mistake ever since. He was looking at her. He had, she suspected, been watching them on internal sensors since the moment the maintenance hatch opened. He did not reach for a weapon. He said in Korath standard with an accent that was not quite right, that had underneath it the ghost of another language. I was wondering when you'd come. Mara's hand was on her sidearm. She did not draw it. You know who I am. I know what you are, he said. I've been watching the settlement feeds for 30 years. Every generation, there's someone like you. He paused. You're the first one who made it this far. What happened to the others? He looked at her with the expression of someone who has decided to stop lying and is finding it less of a relief than they expected. The high priest was informed. The high priest. Mara had last seen the high priest 4 days ago, when he had stood on the speaking platform above the central square of Settlement 3, and announced that the god had spoken, and that the god had said that the people of Korath were falling short of the required devotional standards, and that a tithe increase of 20% would be implemented immediately, and that any family unable to meet the tithe would be accommodated in the labor settlements, which was the covenant's word for the mines. How long have you been up here? She asked. 81 years. She stared at him. He was old, yes, but that's not possible. The ship has medical systems. Good ones. Better than anything below. A pause. That was deliberate originally. The original crew were going to use longevity treatment as an incentive. Come up to the ship, serve the mission, live long. His mouth twisted. A lot of things were deliberate, originally. What was the mission? He looked at the inactive displays. In their dark surfaces, she could see her own reflection, distorted, strange. Control, he said. The Korath Settlement Authority had a resource extraction problem. The settlers were organized, unionized. They had leverage because they had skills the company needed, and they knew it. The company needed something to break that leverage. He spread his hands, a gesture that managed to encompass both the ship and everything below it. Religion has always been effective at making people accept conditions they would otherwise refuse. Mara heard herself say, You told them you were a god. The first crew told them. I was maintenance. I came up when I was 19. The original crew explained the situation. They said it was temporary. They said once the resource extraction targets were met, the program would be wound down, the settlement would be given proper governance, everything would be. He stopped. Temporary, Mara said. The company was bought. The new owners didn't want to wind it down. The resources were still profitable. The control was still useful. And we were still here, and we'd been here long enough that. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had done things with them that he could not undo. The people below had had 2 generations of this. Their grandparents had been colonists who'd signed contracts with the company. By then they were the faithful. They'd never known anything else. If we'd just stopped, he shook his head. The high priest was the 2nd generation. He was born to it. He believed it. He believed it more than we did. But you stayed. Where was I going to go? His voice cracked just slightly. I was 19 when I came up. I'm 100 years old. I have been in this ship for 81 years. I have watched everything below through these screens. He looked up at her. I know your name. I know your mother's name. I know you grew up in the maintenance warrens and that you figured out what you'd figured out when you were 12 years old and that you've been working toward this for 15 years. Then you know why I'm here. Yes. Will you help me? Silence. The ship hummed around them. Somewhere in the engineering section, she could hear Das and Ben moving through corridors, the occasional soft exclamation as they found something. If I help you, the old man said, the high priest will kill everyone in Settlement 3. He has contingency protocols. I've watched him run drills. I know. Then you know that this isn't simple. I know it isn't simple, Mara said. I also know that the labor settlements have a death rate of 30% per year. I know that the tithe increase is going to move another 10,000 families into those settlements. I know that every generation you leave this running, the covenant gets stronger, and the people get weaker, and the window gets smaller. She looked at him steadily. Nothing is simple. The question is whether you're going to sit in that chair for another 20 years watching it get worse. The old man was quiet for a long time. Then he said, My name is Tavith. I haven't said it out loud in a long time. Mara, she said. He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already known. The command systems are locked to the high priest's authorization codes, he said. He changes them every 30 days. Last change was 11 days ago. He paused. But I know things about this ship that the covenant doesn't know. Things the original crew knew, and that I'm the only one who remembers now. Tell me. The high priest's name was Arvith, and he had never doubted. This was his great strength. This was also, in the deepest and most thoroughly unexamined part of him, the thing he feared most. Not that the god was false, which was a thought he had never had, and would not have permitted himself to have, but that his faith was insufficient, that there was some depth of belief he had not yet reached, and that this inadequacy was visible to the God above and would be judged accordingly. He had been born into the covenant and had risen through its ranks by virtue of two qualities, absolute sincerity and absolute ruthlessness, which are not as contradictory as they might seem. He had done everything he had done in complete good faith. He had sentenced people to the labor settlements in complete good faith. He had, on 3 occasions, offers the god to use its fire on settlements that had shown signs of organizational resistance, and he had watched the fire from the speaking platform and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of necessity. He slept 6 hours a night, always, and woke each morning with the feeling that something was wrong, which he had long since attributed to the spiritual burden of leadership. The morning after Mara's team entered the ship, he woke with that feeling and found it was correct. His communication screen was active. On it, a message from the ship's internal sensor network, a network he maintained that he paid 3 of his most technically skilled priests to monitor at all hours. The message was simple. Unauthorized entry, maintenance hatch 7, throw 217 hours, intruder count 5. He sat up. He looked at the message for exactly 3 seconds. Then he began to dress, and his face had the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular contingency for a long time, and was, beneath the anger, almost relieved to finally address it. He called for his warriors. Mara was at the main communications array when Tavith said, quietly, "He knows." She looked up. He was watching a secondary display, a feed from the settlement sensors, she realized, from cameras positioned in places that the Covenant thought were private. She saw Arvith's quarters, saw the high priest standing with his back to the camera, saw the warriors filing in. "How long?" she asked. "They have atmospheric transport. If he moves fast," Tavith calculated. 40 minutes, maybe 35. She had expected this. She turned back to the array. The communications array was old but functional, maintained by the same institutional obsessiveness that had kept everything on this ship running for over a century. It was designed to broadcast to the entire planet, all settlements, all receiving stations, everything that had an antenna. The Covenant used it to transmit the god's voice, pre-recorded messages that Arvith's priests delivered in a synthesized register that sounded approximately like what a god's voice was supposed to sound like, which was to say, like a very large man speaking from inside a tunnel. Tenny had been working on the broadcast systems for 20 minutes. She looked up and said, "Ready. All channels. All channels. Settlements 1 through 14, the outer mining platforms, the northern transit hubs, everything." Mara looked at Tavith. "The longevity systems. You said they were part of the original incentive structure." "Yes. The full treatment was only available up here, but there's a base prophylactic version that can be delivered through the water supply. Life extension of roughly 40% above baseline. The original plan included it as a..." He stopped. His face did something complicated, as a gift, to soften the population. They never used it, no. The new ownership decided that a population with a shortened lifespan was more controllable. His voice was flat. I should have. Can you release it now?" He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. "The water reclamation system is linked to the ship's distribution network," he said. "I retained override access because the Covenant's priests never understood the full architecture. The original crew thought of it as a dead man switch. If the mission was ever shut down precipitously," he exhaled. "Yes, I can release it. All settlements, it would take approximately 6 hours to fully distribute." "Do it," she said. "Now before whatever else happens." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to a panel she hadn't noticed and entered a long sequence of commands. Something in the ship's infrastructure changed, a subtle shift in the vibration frequency, like a valve opening deep below. "Done," he said. He had tears on his face. He was not making any attempt to stop them. "Done. God help me, I should have done it." "Tavith." She put her hand on his arm. "Help me now." He straightened. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He turned to the communications array. "What do you want to say?" he asked. She had written the speech in her head 100 times over 15 years. She had revised it in cell blocks and maintenance crawlways and on cold hillsides watching drone patrols sweep back and forth. She had imagined herself delivering it in a clear, strong voice with perfect composure, every word landing exactly as intended. Instead, she sat in front of the communications array in a ship that smelled of machine oil and old food, with Covenant warriors closing from the south in 35 minutes before whatever came next. And she said, "My name is Mara Sen. I am in the ship that you have been told is your god. I want to tell you what I see." Her voice in the recording was rougher than she expected, unpolished. It was the voice of someone who had grown up in maintenance warrens. "I see corridors. I see equipment racks. I see hull plating with repair patches where the original material degraded. I see manufacturing codes and dates stamped into the metal by people who worked in a factory somewhere and never imagined their product would be used for this. I see a command center with one occupant, a man named Tavith who has been on this ship for 81 years and who wants to tell you something." She looked at Tavith. He said in his accented Korath standard, "My name is Tavith. I was part of the original crew of this vessel. The vessel was placed here by the Korath Settlement Authority to facilitate population control. There is no God. There has never been a God. Everything the Covenant has told you about the divine presence, every judgment, every command, every tithe, every sentence to the labor settlements, it originated here, from people who made choices and then convinced themselves, over time, that those choices were inevitable." He stopped. He pressed his lips together. The longevity treatment that was promised to all settlers in the original colonial charter, it is in your water now. It should reach full distribution within 6 hours. This is not a gift from a god. It is an overdue correction by an old man who has run out of reasons to delay. Mara reached over and closed the broadcast channel. She breathed. Through the command center's forward viewport, she could see the first rim of Korath's larger sun clearing the eastern horizon. The planet below was still in shadow, the settlements marked by clusters of light, millions of people waking to another morning under the eye of what they had always believed was watching them. "They'll need time," Tenny said from behind her, "to process it." "They'll have it or they won't," Ben said. He was looking at the sensor displays. The transport just cleared the southern plateau. 12 minutes. Mara stood. She felt strangely very calm. "Tavith," she said, "the directed energy emitter on the ventral surface. The thing the Covenant calls the God's Mouth. It's been used 4 times in the last 100 years, he said. "Twice in my tenure." He stopped. "I watched it happen. Can you lock it out?" "Yes." "Can you lock out the Covenant's authorization entirely?" "Not override it, lock it out." He understood what she was asking. His face said he understood. "If I lock out their authorization, I also lose my own. The ship becomes inert. The Covenant can't use it. But," he hesitated, "it would also stop the life support systems that the Covenant's maintenance staff have been piggybacking on. 7 of the settlement's air processing units are partially dependent on the ship's power relay." "Partially," Ten said sharply. 40%, maybe 35. Tenny was already moving to a secondary console. "Give me the architecture diagram." "10," Mara said. "I need 4 minutes." "You have 4. Tenny worked with the focused intensity of someone who has spent their entire life being told their curiosity was sinful and has decided definitively that it is not. Her hands moved across the console with a surety that Mara had never seen in a priest or a warrior or any of the Covenant's servants. It was the surety of someone who understood not just the commands but the underlying logic, who could see the structure beneath the interface. "I can reroute the relay," she said, not looking up, "if I use the anchor cable infrastructure as a secondary distribution network." "That'll work," Tavith said, leaning forward despite himself, the reflexive engagement of an engineer who has been starved of engineering problems for too long. "I know it'll work," Tenny said. "I'm telling you I can do it, not asking." His face did something that, in different circumstances, might have been a smile. 3 minutes, Ben said. Mara turned to the viewport. The sun was above the horizon now, and the ship's shadow stretched west across the plateau below, long and dark. For 112 years that shadow had fallen on the people of Korath, and they had looked up and called it sacred. She wondered what they were doing right now, in the settlements, in the quiet minute between hearing her voice on every receiver and deciding what to do about what they had heard. She thought about her mother, who had believed, who had pressed her forehead to the packed earth every evening without fail, who had drawn some genuine comfort from it, who had asked Mara once, gently, why she was always looking for the seams in things, who had died in the labor settlements 3 years ago, which was the reason Mara had stopped writing careful speeches in her head and started planning operations. She thought, "I'm sorry it took so long." "Done," Tenny said. "Lock it, Tavith," Mara said. He entered the command. The ship changed around them, not dramatically, not with any cinematic flourish, just a slight deepening of the hum, and then a change in frequency, and then a settling, like something coming to rest. Several panels that had been lit went dark. The directed energy emitter on the ventral surface is powered down. The command center became quieter than it had been. "It's done," Tavith said. "The Covenant's authorization is locked out. The power relay is rerouted through the anchor network. The life support dependency is severed." He looked at his hands again. "The ship is. It's just a ship now. It's what it always was." The transport arrived at the eastern docking port 40 seconds later. They heard it come in, the clang of magnetic locks engaging, the hiss of an equalization seal. Mara counted footsteps in the corridor outside the command center, more than she could deal with by force. She looked at the communications array. "Is it still broadcasting?" Tavith blinked. The channel was closed. "Open it again." He opened it. She said, "High Priest Arvith, I know you're in the ship. I want you to come to the command center." Silence. Then, through the door, his voice. Even through metal, it had authority in it. The unshakable authority of a man who had never needed to question himself. "You have committed sacrilege of the highest order. You have desecrated the body of the divine. You have." "I've been inside it for an hour," Mara said. "I know what it is. You know what it is." A pause. "Come in," she said. "Alone. Leave your warriors outside." Another pause. She could hear muffled conversation. She could imagine the exchange. The warriors asking for orders, Arvith calculating, the trained theological responses running up against the flat practical reality that whoever this woman was, she had gotten into the ship, and he needed to know how. The door opened. He was younger than she had expected. Not young, probably 60, but she had built him into something older in her mind, some ancient authority. He was a man of average height with gray at his temples and eyes that were currently doing the very rapid work of assessing a situation and finding it more complex than anticipated. He wore the Covenant's formal robes, which up here, in the corridor lighting of a 100-year-old ship, looked like what they were, clothes. He looked at Tavith. Something in his face shifted, not collapsed, not shattered, but shifted, adjusted. The face of someone incorporating information that had been theoretically possible, but practically unthinkable. "You're real," he said. "Not to Mara. To Tavith." "I'm real," Tavith said. "How long," Arvith said, and his voice had changed, "have you been?" 81 years. The high priest stood very still for a long moment. Mara watched him. This was the moment. She had thought about this moment, had imagined it going a dozen different ways. The man who had sentenced 10,000 people to the labor settlements. The man who had authorized the fire. The man who had been born to a faith that was a lie and had built his entire life, his entire self, inside it. "The labor settlements," she said. 3,000 people currently incarcerated. I want them released." He looked at her. His eyes were doing something she hadn't expected. They were wet. "I believed," he said, not as a defense, more as a statement of fact, an attempt to give her accurate information about the person she was dealing with. "I know," she said. "I watched you. From below. I thought the covenant, the tithes, the settlements. I thought it was serving. I know." She stood. She was aware that behind the door, his warriors were armed and waiting. She was aware the broadcast was still open on every antenna on Korath. The labor settlements. 3,000 people. "I'm asking you to release them." He looked at Tavith. He looked at Tene. He looked at the dark panels, the locked-out displays, the inert weapons emitter. He looked at the command center of the ship that had been his god, and that was undeniably a room. He said, "I would need to. The authorization protocols, write the order," she said, "by hand, seal it, I'll broadcast it." He stood there. Something in him was working. Not the theological calculation, not the administrative reflex, but something older and slower and more painful. She had seen it before, in people who had spent their whole lives believing something and were in the process of setting it down. It looked like grief. It was grief. The grief of a man losing the world he thought he lived in. She waited. Her mother had believed. Her mother had found comfort in it. And somewhere in Arvith there was a person who had believed something too, who had served it with his whole life, who was now standing in the machine that had eaten that life and understanding, for the first time, what he had been fed. She waited. He said, "Give me something to write on." The release order went out on every channel 4 minutes later, in Arvith's handwriting, in his voice, with his seal. He read it himself, standing in front of the communications array, his voice doing the work it had always done, carrying weight, compelling attention, but aimed now at a different target. Mara listened to him do it and thought, this is also a human thing, the capacity to turn, The capacity to recognize a mistake that has consumed 8 decades and turn anyway, in the time left, towards something else. The response from the settlements came within minutes, not all of it good. The covenant had structures that did not dissolve at a word, even the high priest's word. There were sub-priests who refused to believe, regional controllers who saw the labor settlements as essential infrastructure, warrior units who received the broadcast and decided it was a forgery. There would be months of this, years probably. The liberation of 10,000 people from a century of institutional theology was not going to happen in an afternoon. Ben, standing at the sensor display, said, "Settlement 5 is mobilizing. That's the commander who ran the last tithe enforcement. He's not going to stand down." "No," Mara agreed. "We have no leverage against him. The ship is inert." "We have something better than leverage," she said. "We have 3 million people who heard what Tavith said about the longevity treatment. They know it's in the water. They know it was owed to them from the beginning. They know who sat on it." She looked at the display. "Settlement 5 has a population of 200,000. You think the commander can keep 200,000 people in line with the ship locked, out and the high priest having publicly recanted?" Bethan considered this. "No," he said, "probably not. No DOS." Sitting on a console that was not rated for sitting, said, "What happens to us after?" Mara looked around the command center. Tavith, sitting in the chair that had been his world for 81 years, now watching the settlement feeds with the expression of someone watching something begin instead of end. Tenny, already pulling up the ship's full technical schematics, cataloging the systems that could be useful for what came next. The medical equipment, the atmospheric processors, the manufacturing arrays that had been maintained as divine relics without anyone below knowing that's what they were. Ben and Doss, who had survived things that had killed everyone they started with. Yusuf, who had come in through a hatch at 17 years old and was now sitting on the deck with his back against the wall, looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone whose world had just been significantly recalibrated, and who was not sure yet whether this was terrifying or magnificent. "We stay up here for a while," she said. "The ship has resources. Tavith knows the systems. Tenny needs time to document everything." She paused. "Eventually we open it up, properly. Let people come up, see what it is, learn what it can do. The medical systems alone." "People are going to be angry," Ben said. "Yes, very angry, yes." She looked at him. "They should be. They have the right to be. Our job isn't to make it easy. Our job is to make sure it's survivable." He looked at her with that careful, cataloging attention he'd had since the beginning. Then he nodded once, slowly. In 30 years of this, she had never seen him give that nod to anyone before. She turned back to the viewport. The sun was fully up now. The settlements below were awake and in motion, and she did not know what most of that motion was. Whether it was people running toward the broadcast, receivers, or away from the Covenant's warriors, or sitting in their houses trying to determine whether what they'd heard was true, or pressing their foreheads to the ground, because that was what they knew how to do, and they didn't have anything else yet. She didn't know. She couldn't know. 3 million people making 3 million individual decisions about what to do with a world that had just changed its shape. She thought about the fact that in 6 hours, whatever those people decided, their water was going to be different. Whatever they believed, whoever they chose to follow, their bodies were going to begin living longer than their parents had. You could give people a fact, and some of them would refuse it. You could give people a truth, and some of them would build new lies around it. But certain things, certain physical, irrevocable things, were not available for reinterpretation. That seemed, right now, like enough. Not enough for everything. Not enough for the months ahead, the resistance from entrenched covenant structures, the grief of 112 years of institutional faith colliding with reality, the anger that was justified and the violence that would come from some of it. Not enough for the families who would never get back what the labor settlements had taken from them, the dead who would stay dead regardless of longevity treatments and open ships, and every truth she had managed to extract and broadcast, but enough to start. She thought about her mother. She thought about a woman pressing her forehead to packed earth under a machine she believed was watching her with divine care. She thought about whether any part of that had been comfort, real comfort, the kind that humans make for themselves out of whatever materials are available, even false ones. She thought, for the first time in 15 years of being angry and afraid and certain, that maybe the answer was yes. She hoped her mother had known, in whatever way was available in the maintenance warrens at the bottom of Settlement 6, that her daughter had never stopped looking for the seams. Yusuf from the floor said, "Is it over?" Tenny said, without looking up from the schematics. "No, is the worst part over?" A pause. "Maybe," Tenny said. "Probably not." "Oh," Yusuf said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay." He stood up. Mara didn't ask him to. He just stood up, brushing the deck dust off his jacket with the practical air of someone deciding to be useful, and moved to stand beside Tenny and asked what she needed. Mara watched him, 17 years old, terrified and standing in a god that was a machine, in a room full of people who had dismantled the thing that had governed his entire world, asking what he could do next. She turned back to the viewport. 3 million people below, and the sun fully risen, and the water already changing. The god had been a lie. The lie was over. What came next was the harder, slower, more human work, and she had always been better at maintenance than worship. She rolled up her sleeves. She got to work. 3 months later, they opened the first access hatch to the public. It was not ceremonial. There was no speech. Mara had given enough speeches, had said everything she knew how to say on every broadcast channel on Korath, and was not interested in saying it again in a more orchestrated setting. What happened was that Tenny finished the structural assessment, Tavith signed off on the safety protocols, and Mara sent a message to the newly formed Settlement Authority, a provisional body comprising representatives from all 14 settlements currently meeting in the stripped-out hall of the former Covenant headquarters in Settlement 3, saying that the ship was ready for inspection. The first delegation came up in groups of 12. Engineers, mostly, because engineers were the first to want to see the inside of something, to understand how it worked. Mara walked them through the corridors herself, pointing at the manufacturing codes and the repair patches and the equipment racks, answering questions, watching their faces do the thing faces do when they are given irrefutable evidence of something they already half knew. One of them, a woman about 60 with the kind of practical competence that had apparently survived 3 generations of enforced ignorance, stopped in front of a junction box that had been rewired 8 times with 8 different generations of salvaged materials and said, with a voice that was trying not to shake, "My grandfather helped build the water reclamation network for Settlement 8. He said the plans came from the god, that the god had given them the technical specifications. The plans came from this ship," Mara said. The woman looked at the junction box for a long time. "He was very proud of that," she said. "He should have been," Mara said. "He built something that gave 200,000 people clean water for 60 years. The plans came from here. The work came from him." The woman looked at her. Her face was doing many things at once. "That's not what the Covenant said," she said. "No," Mara agreed. "It isn't." They stood there for a moment in the corridor of the ship that had been a god, and then the woman nodded once and moved on, and Mara moved with her. In the evenings, after the delegations left, Mara and Tavith sat in the command center and talked. He was teaching her the ship's systems. All of them, not just the ones Tenny had already cataloged, but the deep architecture, the things that had been in his head for 81 years, because he had never had anyone to tell them to. He had a quality she had seen in very few people, a quality she associated with those who had lived with a mistake for a very long time. He explained things without either excuse or drama, with a clear-eyed precision that acknowledged what had been and did not attempt to soften it or to declare himself changed in ways he wasn't certain of. "The medical bay on Deck 4, he said one evening. "The original crew intended it for the mission staff only, but the systems are designed for full population service. They can handle output for up to 50,000 patients per year. Settlement 3 alone has 30,000. I know." She looked at the display showing Settlement 3's population distribution. The labor settlements were emptied now. The order had taken 2 weeks to fully implement over regional resistance that had been, in the end, overcome. 3,000 people walking out of the mines, blinking in the light. Several hundred who were not walking, who were carried, or who were brought out in the medical transports she had insisted on. The death toll from the final enforcement push, Covenant warriors unwilling to stand down, was 47. She carried those 47. "The crop yields in Settlement 9, Tavith said, and his voice told her he was watching her think, "are going to fail in the 3rd quarter. I've been monitoring the atmospheric data for 40 years, and I know the pattern." The Covenant had a stockpile protocol. They maintained a 12-month grain reserve in the northern vault. Arvith has turned over the authorization codes. "I know about the reserve," she said. 10 found it in the supply manifests. There's another one, smaller, in the ship. The crew maintains 60 days of emergency stores. It's not much, but combined with the settlement reserve, it buys enough time to source import contracts from the outer platforms before the shortfall. She looked at him. He had been up here for 81 years watching. Not doing, he had not done much, or not enough, but watching and cataloging and accumulating exactly this kind of operational knowledge, the detailed architecture of how things worked below. The things that would matter in the months of transition, when the Covenant's maintenance structures dissolved and something new had not yet fully formed to replace them. "You know where everybody is buried," she said. "Figuratively and otherwise," he said. She thought about that. "I need you down there," she said. "Eventually. You need to talk to people." He was quiet. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You're thinking they'll kill you. Or worse," he said. "They'll listen to me. They'll treat me as an authority. And I'm not an authority. I was never." He stopped. "I was maintenance. I was always just maintenance. And I stayed past when I should have stayed and let it become something else. The last thing those people need is another voice telling them what to do." "I'm not asking you to tell them what to do," she said. "I'm asking you to answer questions. There's a difference." He sat with that. Outside the viewport, Korath's night side was fully dark except for the lights of the settlements, each cluster a different size and shape, 14 different communities that had been under the same false sky for over a century, and were now, each in their own way, working out what to do with open sky. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, "about the original charter." She waited. The Settlement Authority contract, the one that was superseded by the Covenant's governance, it specified not just longevity treatment but full, colonial self-determination within 20 years of settlement establishment. Standard colonial charter provisions. The company violated them when they put the ship up. He looked at her. Those provisions are still technically in force. They were never formally dissolved. The charter was filed with the Interstellar Colonial Registry in the Sol system. He paused. "Which means Korath's situation was always technically illegal under colonial law. Which means there are legal mechanisms available if someone filed a complaint." "The company is 100 years old," Mara said. "Whatever corporate structure, the parent company still exists. 3 mergers, 2 name changes, but the legal entity is traceable. I have the documentation." He reached into the desk beside the command chair and produced a data chip. "I've had this for 40 years. I didn't know who to give it to." She looked at the data chip. "Filing a complaint with the Colonial Registry takes a ship," she said. "A faster-than-light ship. We don't have one." "No," he said, "but the outer mining platforms maintain transit links. The platform operators they've been watching the broadcasts. I've been monitoring their traffic." He almost smiled. "They're very interested." She took the data chip. She turned it over in her hands. 112 years of illegal occupation, on a chip that fit in her palm. In the hands of a woman who had grown up in maintenance, Warren's figuring out the difference between sacred and engineered. The god had been a machine. The machine was now just a ship, and a ship, she had always known, could go places. Yusuf turned 18 in the ship's medical bay, where Tenny had set him to work running diagnostic cycles on the treatment equipment. He did not mention it was his birthday. Tenny found out from the settlement registry and made him a meal from the ship's stores. Something approximating a cake. Given the available ingredients, which was not very cake-like but had been made with intention, which Yusuf seemed to find more significant than the taste. He had been asking questions since the first day, the way only very young people ask questions, without filtering for whether the answer might be inconvenient. He asked Tavith about the original mission, about the company, about what it was like to be 19 on a ship that had just become a god. He asked Tenny about the engineering systems with a focus that she had begun to describe, with some satisfaction, as potentially useful. He asked Bean about the resistance, the years of it, the people who hadn't made it. He asked Mara, once, whether she felt like she'd won. She had thought about it for longer than the question deserved. "I feel like we've gotten through the part that required winning," she said finally. "What's next doesn't work that way." He had nodded slowly, working it out. "Is that better or worse?" he asked. "Different," she said. "Usually better. Sometimes both." He had seemed to find this satisfying in the way that honest non-answers sometimes satisfy people who are asking honest questions. She thought, watching him work alongside Tenny with the concentrated attention of someone who had found a thing worth learning, that there were certain things the Covenant had been right about in their way. Not the God. There was no God. There had never been a God. There would be no pretending otherwise. But the idea that the next generation would be the one to build something. The idea that whatever the current people managed to hold together, the real work was the work that went into who came next. She did not say this out loud. It sounded like a speech, and she had given enough speeches. Instead, she went back to work. The complaint was filed with the Interstellar Colonial Registry 6 months after the ship was opened, carried by a transit vessel from the northern mining platform, crewed by 2 of the platform operators who had been following the broadcasts from the beginning and had decided, as Tavith had correctly assessed, that they were very interested. The company's legal department received it 11 months later. When the transit vessel arrived at the registry station at Procyon's Edge, Mara heard about this 6 weeks after that, when the return signal came through the platform's transit link. The legal department's response was, for the registry's report, a period of approximately 48 hours of what the registry's liaison described as institutional consternation, followed by a settlement offer. She read the settlement offer. It was large. It was also, given what it was attempting to settle, absurd. She filed a counter-complaint and waited. She had learned, in a year of this, how to wait. In the meantime, the medical bay was running at capacity. The longevity treatment was fully distributed, and the settlement physicians, trained now on proper equipment, with access to the ship's medical database, were beginning to see the early markers in the population: systemic age retardation, reduced cellular degradation. The first generation of Korath-born children who would likely live to see their 140th year. Tenney had published the treatment specifications on the Colonial Registry's open database, with a note explaining what they were and where they came from, and recommending that other colonial settlements check their corporate governance structures. The download count on that publication was, by the last report, considerable. Arvith had testified before the settlement authority for 11 days. He had answered every question. He had not minimized and he had not embellished. He had, with the same absolute sincerity that had characterized his belief, given absolute sincerity to his accounting. The authority had debated his situation for 3 weeks. They had sentenced him to service, specifically to the labor settlements he had populated, working in the capacity of logistics coordinator for the remediation projects now underway in the former mining facilities. It was not a gentle sentence. It was not a vindictive one. He had accepted it without appeal. Mara had watched the proceedings but had not attended in person. When Das asked her if she'd wanted to be there, she had said she didn't know, which was the truth. On a morning that was, by her count, 14 months after the night they had climbed the anchor cable, Mara stood at the command center viewport and looked at Korath below. The settlements were the same shape they had always been. The lights were the same lights. The air was the same air. The processors still ran. The water still flowed. The daily mechanics of 3 million lives still operated according to the logic of machinery and bodies and weather, and the 1,000 ordinary decisions that constitute a civilization. But the shadow was gone. The ship had been repositioned 3 months ago, moved carefully, by Tavith and a team of 3 settlement engineers who had spent 2 months learning the navigation systems, to a higher orbit, out of the direct sightline of the settlements. It was still there. It would remain a practical resource for a long time to come. But it was no longer the thing people looked up and saw when they looked up. What they saw now was sky. She thought about that, about what it meant to see sky instead of surveillance, about the generations who had grown up looking up and seen an eye, and the generations who would grow up looking up and see nothing but weather and the stars. She thought about the legal case, which was proceeding with the ponderous certainty of institutional processes that had been correctly engaged and which would eventually produce a result, probably a significant one, probably not as significant as it should be, almost certainly more significant than the company expected. She thought about Yusuf, who had 3 weeks ago asked Tenney to formally take him on as an engineering apprentice, and had been told, with characteristic economy, that she had been assuming that was already the arrangement. She thought about Bien, who had gone back to settlement 6 weeks ago and was running security training for the new civic constabulary, which was what they were calling the Provisional Security Force that was replacing the Covenant's warriors, and who sent her reports every other week with the same careful attention to detail he had always applied to everything. She thought about Tavith, who was in the medical bay below today for the first time talking to patients. He had gone down 2 weeks ago. He had taken no formal role and accepted no authority, and introduced himself to everyone he met simply as Tavith, which most people did not recognize, and explained himself when asked with a directness that apparently some people found uncomfortable and others found, unexpectedly, something like honest. She thought about the data chip and the transit vessel and the legal complaint and the colonial registry and the slow machinery of interstellar accountability, which operated at the speed of light in transit and the speed of bureaucracy in every other respect. She thought about her mother. She thought, I found the seams. From behind her, Tenny said, the Settlement 9 grain shortage. I finished the logistics model. If we use the Northern Reserve and the ship's stores as a bridge, and if the outer platform import contract closes in the next 3 weeks, it will, Mara said. Ben's contact on Platform 6 confirmed last night. Then we have a 17-day buffer before the shortfall becomes critical. That's enough. Barely. Barely is enough, Mara said. A pause. Then Tenny said, with the tone of someone stating a fact that they had decided deserves to be stated, we did well. It was not something Tenny said often, or something Mara had expected her to say. She turned around. Tenny was looking at her schematics, not at Mara with the focused expression she always wore. But she had said it. We did, Mara agreed. The ship hummed. It had always hummed. 112 years of turbines and coolant cycling, and the steady mechanical respiration of a system that had been built to last and had lasted, often for the wrong reasons, but had lasted. She put her hand on the viewport. The glass was cold. Outside, Korath turned in its orbit around twin suns, and the sky above the settlements was open, and 3 million people were living slightly longer than they had expected. And somewhere in the records of the Interstellar Colonial Registry, the case was ongoing. Enough, she thought. For now. She turned from the viewport and got back to work.